Something that's been on my mind and talked about, videos watched, all that, has to do with Calvinism and God's sovereignty and what that means with free will. I was watching a preacher the other day, and he basically said, read Romans chapter 9. That should make it all clear. If you don't believe in the sovereignty of God and His elect and predestination and all this, read Romans chapter 9, and that should be enough for you. And it had this little frog. It had this same exact feel as when somebody said, "Oh, you don't believe in healing? Well, then you need to watch just one episode of something Curry Blake has put on in the air." And I start watching it, and right away, misquoting scripture, and I'm like, well, yeah, okay, watched as much as I could handle. And I'm like, no. And this had the same feel. So I was like, okay, I'm going to be converted to Calvinism, read Romans chapter 9, at least on this point of Calvinism. And I start reading it, and I get what they're saying, but it's just to support what they say, like you have a viewpoint and you read the scripture, and then that's what you end up with. And, I'm trying hard not to do that because I understand I do that same thing. And I was reading it, and then I got to Romans chapter 10, and I started reading, I'm going, well, look, that's all about, just right after that, the first couple of verses says, well, it's talking about free will there. I mean, it's hard for me to believe, too. Like you say, Adam and Eve, at the beginning in the garden, it was God's will to make them sin and then to punish them for it. No free will involved. That's what happened. And then punish all of humanity for something that they did, especially when the scriptures say God doesn't tempt us, that the temptation comes from within us, and then that gives birth to the sin which leads to death. That's not free will. The young man that came up to Jesus and said, what do I need to do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And it's all about Jesus telling him what to do, and then he goes away, and it's about, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, because basically he's relying on himself and not God, I think is the point of that one. But to say he didn't have a choice, it was just a message. Adam didn't have a choice. God was just leading what he wanted to do. Anytime it looks like he has a choice, when Moses falls on his face for Israel, and then God relents on what he was going to do, that's what God intended all the time. It wasn't really Moses' falling on his face and asking for help. Jonah going to Nineveh repenting. They really didn't have a choice. God was just going to show his forgiveness on them, and that's the story that we have. I can't go. That's the same argument as an atheist could make, is that it doesn't matter what we do because it's already been decided for us. Some people say, well, it's decided for you, but how your life is and whether you're blessed or not is what your choices are you're making. Well, wait a second, not choices, because what you're going through is what God has told you to do. Whether you're elect or not is what God has told you to do. It has nothing to do with you falling on your face and breaking down and realizing that you really do deserve death. And if God's going to condemn you for being a broken person, then that's what's going to happen. And you thank God for his salvation because he saves you. And the hope that you have comes from that. Israel, they were shown the glory of God in Egypt. And what happened to all those guys? They didn't have a choice when they went to Mount Sinai, and they all said, yes, we will do what you say we do. And then most of them die in the desert over 40 years. They had a choice then. Korah never came back to God. Israel was a chosen people, but there's definitely Israelites who didn't follow God, and they died in the desert. And I would imagine some of those people who died in the desert did end up following God. It's just they were Even though they were right with God, they were suffering for choices that they have made, and that was just a situation they were in. Once they were right with God, they went from broken to straight, and that was great. So, not a fan of kind of a dictatorish type style of God. I'm not going to put God in as a dictator that is just decided everything. His will be done. But you've got to want to serve him with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. You need to give yourself to him. I mean, he's worth serving. If you were destined, like somebody said, well, he makes some vessels for destruction. If I was a vessel for destruction, I would hope that I would be on my face before God and say, you know what? I deserve it. If that's what I am, I deserve it. Please forgive me. Please give me hope. Please change me. As the potter changes, he can make the pot whatever he wants. Vessel of destruction becomes something different. That's in the Bible. So if you were made and you are clean, he talks about cleaning unholy vessels so that they're holy. I mean, that is what I would hope. God of the universe deserves to be served, even if he doesn't do anything for you. He created everything. I mean, I'm out in beautiful land. How can you even be in a situation like this and not recognize God? I don't get that. And so when you look into the scriptures and you say, well, this thing that it looks like they had a choice, he didn't really have a choice. The young rich man, he didn't really have a choice. Nineveh, they really didn't have a choice. I think that's putting things into the scripture that's not there. It all has to come back to scripture. You got to put everything through the eyes of scripture. And if you don't, it really is wrong. And if you get corrected, you need to make sure that you're not just making the scriptures say what you want them to do. That's why you need to be praying for discernment. God said he'll open our eyes to the scriptures. Sometimes, though, we let things get in our way. Doctrines of men. And that's just all I want to say. And I hope you guys have a blessed day.
Charles Spurgeon once said that God predestines and that man is responsible are two things that few can see. They are believed to be inconsistent and contradictory, but they are not. It is just the fault of our weak judgment. Two truths cannot be contradictory to each other. If, then, I find taught in one place that everything is foreordained, that is true. And if I find in another place that man is responsible for all his actions, that is true. And it is my folly that leads me to imagine that two truths can ever contradict each other. These two truths, I do not believe, can ever be welded into one upon any human anvil, but one they shall be in eternity. They are two lines that are so nearly parallel that in the mind that shall pursue them farthest will never discover that they converge. But they do converge, and they will meet somewhere in eternity, close to the throne of God, whence all truth doth spring.